All right. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I hope everyone has really enjoyed the hackathon so far. A lot of great entries and some really cool bounties that you can go after. I think some of these things are really going to spread some innovation into DeFi right now, and they can be really helpful to those protocols that are putting these out. But right now, today, we're going to talk about some really cool things that are happening in DeFi and kind of the realistic aspects of finance and the effect that might have in terms of risk. So let's get into it. So what is capital efficiency? How does that apply both in TradeFi and DeFi? And specifically, what does risk look like with capital efficiency in DeFi these days as we see it right now? So first off, what is capital efficiency? So fundamentally, capital efficiency is really just about using money wisely. It has to do with are you using the full potential of what that money truly represents at its base level? But that's a little vague at this point. So let's talk about a few ways in terms of what using money wisely in both business and investing really means. So let's first look at the business side of things. So for businesses, really your end goal is to produce a product or service. And so what you're trying to make sure is that you can deliver those products and services, and the earnings that you're getting from those products and services are efficiently used in terms of the assets that you've employed to provide those things. So it's an earnings versus assets kind of outlook. For most businesses, they're going to take this perspective. Some businesses will use a specific metric called return on capital employed, and that really just has to do with what are you bringing in, what are your earnings, and relative to the assets, and of course the expenses, the short-term liabilities that you've put on burden on your business as well. Some of you in the software side of things might also use a metric more similar to how much annual recurring revenue are you bringing in, new revenue you're bringing in relative to your burn rate in terms of your expenses. But really that also has to do with what is your chief metric, and for SaaS businesses, that's growth, and what are your expenses relative to that. So how much are you using in terms of capital to achieve the primary goals of your business? But what about investing? So investing also has a product, and that product is purely funds. And so you're going to expense purely funds in order to gain purely funds. And so it looks a little bit different, but really fundamentally, it really is the same thing. So it's a yield perspective versus money risked. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the key metric that is going to be used in the financial world and the investment world, return on investment. And that really just is, how effectively are you bringing in yield on the money that you have put out there you could potentially lose. But let's look at some examples for both the business side and the investment side. Let's kind of make some of these metrics and things a little more tangible. So in business, so let's look at one specific case, container ships. And I think we've all kind of read up on these things recently with the constraints in our global supply chain recently. I'm sure this is a familiar topic for a lot of you. But essentially, if you are a shipping company and you have a container ship and you're moving containers from one port to the other, in our current global economy, typically you have ports that are going to be mostly exporting certain products in those containers, and then other ports that are going to be mostly importing products in containers. And so they're not necessarily going to be the inflows and outflows at each one of those ports are not going to be equal, especially relative to the type of thing you're moving and the type of containers you're using. So you're going to end up with certain ports that have a lot of unused empty containers, and you have certain ports that are going to need more containers to fill things up. And so one efficient way of using, if you're a shipping company, one efficient way of using your asset, which is your cargo ship, is to put it into use when you're traveling from every port, from one port to the other, and even on your return trip, you're still putting it to use. And so in the modern global shipping world, putting it to use would mean taking those containers back from where you've delivered empty containers back to another port that's going to need them. So that is increasing the efficiency of your business, but because you either might get paid to take those containers, or in many cases, you are the one using those containers and it cuts on your costs. So that is one way where you can use capital more efficiently. Others might be if you're using a computer for multiple uses, so you're a manufacturing company and you have a computer your analysts are using and you're running your manufacturing equipment, maybe that's not safe, but that would be one way of using your capital, those computers that you bought, more efficiently for multiple uses. So in the business world, there are a lot of ways that we can see efficiency in terms of employed capital in various industries. But what about investing? What does it look like for the investing world? So obviously, with money as your only product and your only input there, you're going to see it a little bit differently. But in this case, you can still make your money more useful for businesses or even retailers, for normal investors. If you want to go and you need to buy things, it would be more efficient rather than taking the cash that you have and spending that cash on something. You can take that money, put it into a bank, maybe a savings account that might earn a little bit these days, not earning a whole lot, but you can earn a little bit. And then you can use those statements to then open some kind of credit account, and you can charge those expenses to that credit account, give you a little more time before you have to pay things back to make a little bit more money off of that investment that you probably loaned out to other people. So in the business world, this is especially relevant because you might have a lot of expenses, especially as a startup, in your first years of operating, and you need to go ahead and go into debt of some kind while you kind of delay on paying some of those things back. And so if you're investing some of the cash that you do have, and instead putting some of those things on some kind of credit line, even if you're losing money in terms of yield, you're hoping the business will reap more yield in terms of its productivity, and you still have that cash underlying it at your disposal if needed. So that is one way in terms of the traditional financial world that you might see with retailers or small businesses in terms of how they're putting their capital to more use. But what about DeFi? This is where things get interesting. So in DeFi, let's first talk about some inefficiencies, and then we'll get into how some of those inefficiencies can be overcome with the current state of DeFi. So right now in DeFi, there actually have several areas that are more inefficient than the traditional financial world. And there are definitely improvements being made, but let's just talk about one of them. Idle funds in a decentralized exchange, a DEX. A decentralized exchange, the liquidity in a typical decentralized exchange is pooled. So on the screen here, you can see there's a little graph. There is an X and a Y axis here. This defines essentially two different tokens. One is a token X, the other is token Y, and they're put into a pool in a decentralized exchange. And the ratio between the two, in terms of the amount of tokens in that pool, defines the swap price between the two. And so if on this curve, you can kind of find the current price based on what that ratio is between the two tokens. But the problem with this is that because all of these funds are pooled and defined in their price on this one line, even if the entire market agrees that these tokens should be valued roughly in the same area, whenever you make a swap, you're going to move the price along that line regardless. If you make any change to the ratio in the pool, the price is going to change along that line, even if it's more than really what the general market intends it to be. Unlike, say, an order book where you can have a lot of funds allocated to a very specific price, kind of where the market agrees it would be, and your efficiency in terms of the ratio of the tokens, the swap rate of the two tokens would be much more efficient. So what we've seen over the last few years in terms of the decentralized exchanges and how the prices and ratios are defined between the tokens can be pretty inefficient. There can be a lot we call slippage of that price as funds move around, and the general market will lose value to people who are willing to take advantage of that price slippage and gain back some of that value by readjusting the price. And so really the essential key thing here to keep the price from slipping is to put a lot of funds in, but that necessarily means that there are a lot more funds being allocated that are not really being put to use. So there's a lot of idle funds in the current decentralized exchanges. And again, there are a lot of innovations out there that are working on fixing these problems, but this is still the case in a lot of exchanges out there. So let's talk about how do we overcome some of these inefficiencies, whether they're things that are less efficient than the traditional financial world, or even if they already are more efficient than the traditional financial world, how do we make things even more efficient? Well, what we can do is we can tokenize the assets, tokenize the capital that we have invested, and we can then use those tokenized versions elsewhere in DeFi to then reap more yield off of the idle parts of that capital. So let's walk through some examples here of what that might actually look like in DeFi. So one of the cool things I think we're going to be seeing more of this year is something called liquid staking. So in proof of stake blockchains, you have a blockchain that is really only secure when you have a lot of the native tokens staked in validator nodes that are then processing the transactions and validating this current state of the blockchain to reach consensus. And only if enough of those tokens are being staked in that way can the blockchain really be secure. So you want to incentivize this behavior. Now, obviously, there is some natural incentive. If you've staked your tokens in a validator node, you're going to get some of the yield, some of the fee generated from transactions are going to be returned to you with your proportion. But often the yields on validator staking are just not high enough. So we're going to work through some very, very rough examples here. Let's say 5% you staked BNB in a validator node, and you're making about 5%. Let's just make it easy and say you've done $1 worth of staking here. So that if you're using a third-party service to do your validator staking, you're not doing it yourself, they're going to give you a derivative token, a token that's representative of your staking on the validator node. And if you're doing that with an entity that is large enough, that has provided enough derivative tokens out there into the market, then there's going to be a marketplace that forms around these, what we call liquid staking tokens. We call it liquid staking because you're creating some liquidity to something that would be locked up, those staked tokens. Now, those staked tokens, these derivative tokens, liquid staking tokens, are soft pegged to the underlying token. So they are obviously going to be representative of that. Now, in certain blockchains, Ethereum would be one. At this point, if you're staking on like ETH2, you're going to be waiting an indefinite period of time until, phase 1.5 or whatever, until we can unstake those. So there's a little bit difference of maybe the price variation of that soft peg aspect we're talking about than you might see on others. But say on Avalanche, you've got 30 days. You can unstake your tokens after you indicate you want to unstake, wait 30 days and they'll come back to you. Or on BNB Smart Chain, you can do that in 7 days. So, but even on BNB Smart Chain, with only 7 days you have to wait, there might be a little bit of price changes there. And so there's a little bit of risk added into your staking, and you're getting that derivative token. But of course, you're also getting yield. So that does overcome, in many cases, that risk concern. But what are you going to do? That liquid staking token you've gotten that represents that underlying stake, the value is not completely being utilized there. Just because you've staked there and you're providing value to secure the blockchain, there's a lot more things you can do with BNB, and liquid staking tokens allow you to do that. So we take that tokenized version of that underlying token, we're going to go do something with it. So there's a lot of people out there who either want to buy a liquid staking token without having to go to a validator and stake it, or they have staked their BNB in this case, and they want to get out of it sooner than the 7 days. And so there's demand that's created around those tokens in, say, a decentralized exchange. We need a way to swap between, in this case, BNB and the liquid staking version of BNB. And so you can put your tokens into a decentralized exchange. You can become a liquidity provider, and you get those LP tokens that represent your contribution as a liquidity provider. And that in and of itself is another tokenized representation of that underlying value that you have put in. And so now you're also getting yield off of the fee generation of the swaps that occur in the pool that you're in. But your value itself is, if soft peg, it's remained the same. So you still got $1 there. Now those LP tokens, as we talked about earlier, they're not going to be fully utilized in terms of what we're doing on the market and how we're employing our capital. They're not fully capital efficient. So let's take those LP tokens. Let's do something else with them to increase our efficiency. So one other thing that we can do, something we've seen in the last year, is the ability to take LP tokens and you can put them into a stablecoin minting protocol and you can mint stablecoins. A number of stablecoin protocols have allowed this with LP token collateralization. So these crypto collateralized stablecoins, it's essentially a loan. If you're depositing collateral and you're minting these stablecoins, you can, let's say in this case, you mint 60% of what you have deposited. So you've taken a loan out, you've added money to the amount of total capital that you have, locked up that dollar, but you're also paying a little bit of a fee. So let's just roughly say 5% you're paying there. So you're losing a little bit of yield, you've gained some more money this way. Well, let's go do something else with that. Now we have these stable coins. They're going to be in demand in the rest of DeFi. Let's go ahead and go and deposit them into a lending protocol. You might want to check out Venus while you're out there. And one of the great lending protocols on BNB Smart Chain. So you can go and deposit those stable coins that you've minted. You can get some yield off of providing supply to borrowers out there. And if you want to, in fact, you could just go ahead and borrow yourself. So let's say that what you're borrowing allows you to borrow up to 60% on top of that. Now you're up to $2.56. Of course, you're going to be paying a little bit of interest on what you've borrowed, but you have leveraged up the amount of capital that you have available. And then of course we can keep doing this. We now have borrowed tokens. We can go out into the other parts of DeFi and do general yield farming, and which is probably one of these other layers or something else that we haven't talked about here. And you can get additional yield on top of that. You're squeezing out every bit of capital efficiency that you can possibly get in the rest of DeFi. And of course, all of these layers, you can do them in a lot of different orders. That's what a lot of these protocols out there have done. They've offered different types of services, different types of things that you can invest. And so this is kind of a loop that goes back and forth, and that's what a lot of yield farming does for you. But what does that mean? It sounds pretty crazy when we're leveraging up, we're wrapping these tokens, we got all these layers. What does that really mean in terms of risk? So there's two key aspects of risk that can be dangerous. So risk themselves, in terms of the layers of that you've created, the first one, they can be hard to unravel. So sometimes certain activities that you're doing in DeFi might require a certain amount of time to get out of that position. And if you have an underlying position that needs to be covered because the prices have changed and you're kind of locked in at a higher level, then that can be very, very difficult to overcome if you don't have extra capital. So these layers can add risk because it's hard to unravel. And sometimes just things like the block speed. If your blockchain is congested and you're unable to unwrap these things in time, then that could also lead to bankruptcies that are unintended simply because of the delays in processing. The second, and this is the most important aspect of the risk that comes into play, is it's very hard to measure. And we see this in a lot of areas of DeFi. What does one protocol do to affect another one out in DeFi? How does this giant web of financial layers impact each other? It's hard enough to value the risk of one protocol, much less all of them working together. So that is the biggest danger in terms of risk for any investor. Some slight changes in a lower layer in this aspect could be magnified because you've leveraged up, can be magnified in higher layers, and you can just not expect certain things given the complexity of some of the financial engineering that's going on. But let's not just ream on DeFi here. Let's talk about this aspect of hard to measure risk exists in traditional finance as well. Let's look at the 2007 mortgage-backed security crisis. Essentially what was going on is that institutions were dividing low-quality loans into what are called tranches. A senior tranche is kind of funneled funds from a junior tranche. And they have lower yield, but they're guaranteed supposedly that yield, while the junior ones kind of get sacrificed, but potentially get higher yield if the market goes into a downturn. But in that case, all of these products in terms of mortgage-backed securities were layered very, very complexly in a similar way. And it was very hard to measure what the risk was. And so ultimately these high-level layers were getting rated at a higher risk than they should have been. People were relying on them too much. And then once the cash flows from the underlying mortgages failed, the entire system just could not support, the junior tranches could not support the seniors enough, and everything collapsed. So this is not something that's isolated to DeFi. This is something that exists in all of finance. So DeFi, though, it is the future of finance, because the ways in which that we can innovate are so much faster and more transparent than traditional finance. We can create new ways of measuring risk, new ways of understanding the financial market, new ways of understanding financial engineering, when before it was very, very opaque. And on the blockchain, with the way that DeFi is working and where it's going, it increases that transparency and general financial innovation. But remember, it does not remove that inherent risk that exists in all of finance. And the most important thing to remember, the biggest aspect of trying to measure if something really makes sense or not in terms of how risky it is, financial engineering is great. It's what makes our modern economy work. But added value really comes ultimately from real world productivity. So if you don't think that real world productivity has increased, injecting efficiency and value into the system, then you might want to be a little wary whether their claims of just an inherent value in the financial system is really there. So always keep that in mind. But look forward to way more innovation coming out in DeFi. This is one of the most exciting fields you could possibly get into, and it really is the future of finance. It's exciting to be here with you all.